Welcome to a special edition of Get Your News On with Ron, where I have a guest today, Shahid Buttar, who is running against Nancy Pelosi. Now, Shahid, you're a musician, which we're going to talk about that a little bit. You're an activist, and you are running against Nancy Pelosi up in the San Francisco area. So let's jump in right away, because I know you told me off mic you just came from a fundraiser or a protest, rather, that you were participating in, because it was a Pelosi fundraiser. Yeah. So let's start a little backwards from there and then work up to that. So, you know, I'm not a fan of Nancy Pelosi for all the obvious reasons. But my question to you is that when you're out there and you're kind of speaking to just general folks that might not be as entrenched in all this stuff, if you will, how do you break it down to them that Nancy Pelosi needs to go?
I just tell people, and I can back it up with any number of examples, but Nancy Pelosi is a Democratic Speaker of the House who, from one issue to the next, unfortunately advances conservative interests. She capitulated yesterday in a deal with the Trump administration to essentially fund his border and inhumane detention policies. We're talking about the concentration camps here on the border, without any protections for asylees and their families, without any protections for human rights. Knowing what this administration is up to, she still essentially signed the Senate bill without any meaningful resistance at all. And it's the very same resistance that she has reduced to a hashtag that has defined my career in a meaningful way for the last 20 years. And I'm tired of seeing, as since I graduated from Stanford Law School in 2003, when I've, from the impact litigation I've done, to the direct action work that I've done, to the musical propaganda that I've been putting out for 20 years, I've been building the left edge of the movement, watching particularly the now Speaker of the House on issue after issue, from funding Bush's wars and essentially helping facilitate CIA torture, to insulating the NSA surveillance regime, to throwing immigrants under the bus, not just yesterday, but last year as well. The PAYGO rules, the fiscal austerity rules, supporting Trump's foreign policy, insulating him from impeachment. I could go on. But Nancy Pelosi is the head of the Democratic Party, but you wouldn't necessarily know it from the broad sweep of history, recognizing the litany of ways in which, unfortunately, she plays on the field like a 1990s Republican.
Do you bring up the fact that she has made herself a 100 millionaire well in office?
I feel like that's a better point for others to raise than me. Okay. I feel like it's the slightest bit ad hominem, and I'd rather confront her policies. But that is a concern for me. I think that when we see members of Congress getting wealthy, we should be alarmed. And the fact that the average net worth of a senator is in the millions is a problem, a very deep problem for our democracy, because it suggests that we are less a democracy than we are possibly a plutocracy.
Well, I think it speaks to her corruption too. I think it's a Truman quote, and I forget the quote off the top of my head, but it's like along the lines of, if you get that rich in office, it's because you're a criminal. So I think it kind of speaks to her corruption, and when you're trying to unpack that for people. But I understand what you're saying. Well, it's up to other people to raise it. And, well, I just did. So there you go. We're making it happen in this interview.
I'd make an analogy, if I may, between corruption and racism. A lot of people think of racism as prejudice, but racism is not just prejudice. Racism is prejudice plus power. It is an institutional phenomenon. And when I think about corruption, I think about institutional corruption. There are other kinds of corruption, and you're right to raise them. I'm just focused on the sort in particular that I have a chance to fix and address.
Policy.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, then how do you unpack if someone says, well, what about Nancy Pelosi? She's good on healthcare. She's been a leader when Obamacare got instituted. Yeah. I think she's the right person for that issue. What do you say to that person?
I say, to her credit, now Speaker Pelosi helped usher a bill through the House under the Obama administration that did include a public option, but that's the last time she showed up for anything that looks like healthcare for all Americans. In the recent, since becoming Speaker, her aides have been affirmatively undermining the Medicare for All proposals promoted by Senator Bernie Sanders, introduced by Representative Pramila Jayapal. Nancy Pelosi, is much more a friend to the pharmaceutical and the health insurance industrial complex than she is to public health, or the health and the interest of her constituents. And a lot of people, I do think, have this confused notion that she must be fighting for progressive policies because she's the head of the Democratic Party, not realizing that she is essentially the centrist brake on the progressive inclinations of a party that is increasingly inclined towards and ready to embrace bold, transformative solutions to the multiple compounding crises that confront our country, from the climate crisis to our economic crisis to the travesty and slow motion of mass incarceration to the creeping rise of authoritarianism in the form of mass and targeted surveillance. On all of these different issues, for better or worse, Speaker Pelosi has not been fighting for progressive interests.
How do you break down the concept? And again, we're still on the lens here of you're talking to just a general voter that you're trying to win over.
Sure.
How do you break down the concept of pay go to them and unpack that issue?
I say that in the 90s, Democrats and Republicans spent a lot of time fighting over accounting rules. And the reason they spent that time fighting over accounting rules is that Republicans favor a discriminatory regime in which the military and all of the corporate contracts fueling fraudulent, wasteful, unnecessary weapons programs are allowed to spend money into the federal deficit. Whereas, under the Republican view that Nancy Pelosi supports, we can't spend into the deficit to make sure that Americans have a roof over their head or can get to a doctor or medicine or food, right? Social services spending under the Republican demand, to which Speaker Pelosi conceded immediately upon becoming Speaker of the current Congress, that demand imposes a discriminatory regime that essentially hamstrings progressive social spending priorities, privileges military industrial corruption, and unfortunately gives away the game at the outset. And if we're going to have a Democratic Speaker of the House imposing Republican fiscal austerity rules, we should at least understand what's happening here and be ready to clamor as the left edge of the party for a new voice that would give us different opportunities in Washington.
So give me the 30-second pitch then. You're going door to door. You're saying who you are, what you're running for.
Yep.
Boom. Pretend I just opened my door and I'm bummed out because you interrupted my coffee and my porn watching. I mean breakfast. But go ahead.
Sorry to bother you. My name is Shahid Buttar. I'm running to represent you in Washington, here in California's 12th Congressional District. I want to make sure that you and your parents can get medicine and a doctor, and that your tax dollars pay for it. I want to make sure that your kids can survive the coming climate crisis and that we embrace robust solutions to it. I ran against Pelosi in the last cycle, got more votes from the left than any primary challenger in a decade. And with your support, I look forward to liberating the seat next year.
What's wrong with Nancy Pelosi?
Well, the very short answer is that she is sadly complicit in corporate rule. She's refused to let tired troops come home. That's a complaint that I've heard from a veteran. She has undermined your right to access healthcare services with your tax dollars paying for it. She's been a friend of every military intervention that has fueled the continuing climate crisis and the corruption that President Eisenhower warned us about. And when there have been Republican presidents in office, she has helped advance their agendas.
How will you be different?
I've spent 20 years fighting for your rights. For instance, one of the very first things I did after I graduated and had taught as a student at Stanford Law School was filed the very first case asserting marriage equality for LGBT couples in the state of New York. This was in 2004. There were very few Democrats, I could count them on one hand, in the country who supported marriage equality for consenting adults to marry the partner of their choice at the time. Nancy Pelosi was not one of them. I was. I am a cis, hetero Muslim male, and I was helping initiate court battles to vindicate the rights of my neighbors almost a decade before Speaker Pelosi showed up for the rights of my neighbors. And with helping to initiate the movement that was secured, one of the very few areas where I think people recognize the progressive movement has actually secured meaningful gains in the last generation. I'm very proud of that. I'm particularly proud of having helped make a seemingly impossible transformative vision become real and change the lives of thousands, if not millions of people, if not tens or hundreds of millions of people for that matter. I'm very proud of having done that before. And for the last decade, I've spent my time fighting mass surveillance and trying to defend American democracy from the bipartisan assault on your right to dissent and your right to freedom of conscience. And that's an issue that very much alarms me as an immigrant constitutional lawyer. I'm not willing to let the vestiges of liberty die on my watch. And as an activist, as a lawyer, as a nonprofit leader, in the courts, in Congress, even without a seat in the policy sphere and in the media, I've been fighting for your rights for the entire 20 years that I've been out of law school. And I've watched for that entire time Speaker Pelosi unfortunately undermine many of the very same human rights interests that I've been helping advance.
So look, I appreciate all this, and I'm very intrigued by you. But my coffee is getting cold. I got to finish my cereal here. A big concern about me is my health care. I don't have very good health care. I feel like we're messing up with health care in this country. I also have a ton of student loan debt. I'm worried about. I thought that I was going to become a millionaire with this art history degree. Turns out that's not the case. I don't know what to do here. I have a nice job, but San Francisco is not getting cheaper. Rent here is out of control, by the way.
It is.
I happen to not be in a rent-controlled place in this scenario I'm making up. I know a lot of San Francisco actually is rent-controlled, but Joe here, I'm not. So for the sake of this example, what are you going to do about those issues?
Those are all important issues, and I'm so glad that you raised them. And you're totally right. Our healthcare system in this country is ridiculous. It would be hard to design a worse system if you tried. We pay more money for healthcare than any country in the world, and we get the worst outcomes demonstrably. And we know that other countries with less resources than ours are able to ensure that everyone can get to a doctor, can get medicine, can get surgeries when they need them without needing to risk bankruptcy or healthcare or homelessness. There's a couple of things to think about here in particular. For you, as somebody who needs access to healthcare, you should have access to preventive care. It's cheaper for all of us as a society if you get access to preventive care. It's also cheaper for all of us as a society if we use our collective bargaining power, that is to say the government's purchasing power, to drive down the costs of pharmaceuticals. Corporate Democrats prohibited the government from doing that, which is to say there are easy ways for us to cut fat out of the system, to drive down costs, to expand patient access to care. And
so what do you support?
Medicare for all. Pramila Jayapal has a bill that would very simply use your tax dollars to fund a national health insurance system that basically the government would pay for. You could still choose your doctor, you could still choose your provider, and whatever the preventive or crisis care that you might need access to, it's paid for by your tax dollars, instead of spending that money on missiles and weapons and unnecessary wars for profit abroad and to support corporate resource extraction. I want to invest that money back into our communities, back into your doctor. And that's going to make both the cost drop down dramatically by expanding access to preventive care, by leveraging government purchasing power to drive down the cost of pharmaceuticals, by eliminating administrative waste across redundant layers of insurance. And we're going to get better outcomes, particularly because people will finally gain access to the same preventive care that other people around the world have long had access to, even in countries with less money than ours. You also asked about jobs and college debt. I'm still paying off my student loans. I graduated from Stanford Law School 16 years ago, going on 17 years ago. And I'm still $50,000 in debt. I am very concerned about the cost of education, and I want to make sure that public universities and colleges have free options for everyone, right? I mean, there's a means testing option here for forgiving student debt, and then there's a universal way of doing it. And I'm much more interested in the universal way that makes college a realistic, viable option for all Americans, whatever your starting point may have been, whether you have parents who themselves are college professors or whether no one in your family's been to college. It's not just the access to the institutions, it's the ability to pay for them. And colleges are another way. You can look at this particularly when you look at the government spending on prisons versus universities. If we spent the same money on universities that we did on prisons, college would be free for everyone. And that's exactly what I plan to do, is to support that kind of funding allocation.
So you support free college?
I do, absolutely, at public universities, and debt relief for people who are laboring under the burden of student loans.
Do you support Bernie Sanders' plan for?
I do, yeah.
Okay.
The key to Bernie Sanders' plan is that he's going to raise the money from a Wall Street transaction tax. And that's incredibly important because it basically helps unwind the distributive injustice that happened in 2008 when the economy was collapsing. And the Obama administration basically bailed out banks and left the rest of America hanging high and dry, particularly fleecing students, because Joe Biden helped pioneer a reform to prevent students from seeking relief from their student debt burdens through the bankruptcy that, for instance, industrialists or speculators or investors can access for failed investments.
Friendly Uncle Joe did that? You've got to be kidding me.
Indeed. I mean, Uncle Joe is not just creepy, but he basically resigned an entire generation to indentured servitude. And that's why I think so many young people are trending so hard to the left. You know, I think there's a confused, an ignorance, frankly, across most of the body politic about how there is an earthquake that is happening slowly across the country. And it's a very predictable one, because as boomers transition, and millennials have already become the largest generational voting bloc in the country, and they are the Republic's most progressive generation in our history, particularly because they grew up with Uncle Joe fleecing them. There are huge opportunities here to, for instance, introduce and secure a federal jobs guarantee. I want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to participate in retooling the economy to create the sustainable economy based on renewable energy infrastructure that can be viable and present a viable future for human life on this planet. And the federal jobs guarantee will be particularly crucial here in California, for instance, in enabling some of the very high labor intensive jobs, like, for instance, clearing underbrush from forests that are otherwise prone to wildfires. For millennia, people did that, but in the westward expansion and the confusion of manifest destiny, we committed a genocide against the people who did that, right? And so no one has been managing forests in North America for the last 150 years. That's a very labor-intensive job. We can put a generation of people to work doing that. And that's exactly what we have to do, both to address our economic crisis and to build our resiliency in the face of mounting global climate chaos.
Well, Mr. Buttar, Joe Voter here likes a lot of what you have to say. And, I also, I pay attention some, and climate change is a big issue to me. I remember Nancy Pelosi condescendingly called the Green New Deal the Green Dream or whatever. Do you support the actual Green New Deal?
I do, absolutely. And in fact, I not only support the Green New Deal, but I want to make it stronger. I want to help develop it into policy. Some people criticize the Green New Deal for being just a vision. The reason it's just a vision is because the generation of policymakers who preceded us in Congress haven't shown up for work. Nobody's developed the legislation to enact a robust, meaningful solution to the climate crisis. That's why the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis is doing that work now. Unfortunately, Speaker Pelosi denied that committee policymaking authority. She even denied it the authority to issue subpoenas to conduct meaningful investigations. I'm not only committed to climate justice, but I want to see it effectuated in real policy that will, for instance, retool the economy, that will, for instance, ensure a just transition for workers displaced from fossil fuel extraction and using industries, that will, for instance, ensure that when we want, for instance, here in California, cannabis is a legal cash crop, but it's not legal in most other states, and it's not legal at the federal level. Part of the Green New Deal, I think, is legalizing cannabis at the federal level, both to allow access to banking services for people in cannabis industries and to allow interstate commerce and import and export of cannabis. That's going to enable a boom, a wave of green jobs in a carbon sequestering cash crop. That's beneficial not just from a climate standpoint and from a job standpoint. It'll be a particular fiscal stimulus to states like California and many across the South that could frankly use it. And I think above all else, legalizing cannabis is a federal civil rights imperative, because at the same time as building the Green New Deal, we also, part of a just transition has to include ending mass incarceration. We want to create meaningful opportunities for everybody, and the racialized caste system that our criminal injustice system has created is untenable. It is a blight on our species, not just our nation. It is a moral travesty, frankly. And legalizing cannabis will at least reduce one way that people get railroaded into the system. Even though here in California we have legal access to cannabis, it's still a pretext to harass, arrest, detain, charge, and jail young people and low-income people of color across the country.
Cool. All right. So Joe Voter is gone now. He took your flyer and he's very interested. He liked what you had to say.
Thank you, Joe.
So
is this Ron back now?
This is Ron. I'm here again.
Hey, Ron,
yeah, I'm good. How are you? I take this advice for what it's worth. I'm a comedian streaming from my living room, but I'd be careful when you're talking about healthcare. How often you use that access word. Access is usually used as a buzzword by establishment Democrats who don't actually support Medicare for all. You do support Medicare for all. So I'd be careful with that verbiage there. I don't think you were using it in a disingenuous way because you support Medicare for all.
Right.
But I just think
it's used in a disingenuous way by lots of people. No, you're totally
right. It totally does. Yeah. So I'd be careful. I would, maybe frame it differently. But those are just my thoughts for what it's worth.
No, it's super helpful. I appreciate it. There's a similar thing I've heard recently with, we talk about climate change and climate delay and climate denial. And all of those terms, to some extent, I think are becoming discursively obsolete, because to speak about climate change or global warming themselves, sort of leave discursive cards on the table. When I talk about those issues now, I talk about the climate emergency, climate chaos, and climate crisis. Yeah. And if you say climate change in some circles, people will be like, "What are you? Are you Nancy Pelosi?" Or, like, we have to be a little bit more willing to frame the facts. And it's not just change; it is a crisis, and it will be chaos, and we need to build resiliency to it. And I especially appreciate your point about healthcare, not just access to it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I'm glad that they are at least saying climate denial finally, because before it was just like, well, I don't believe in climate change. And that frustrated me to no end. It's science. You don't get to believe or not believe in it. It's an evolving body of work. Yeah, exactly. Like you believe or don't believe in a God or something like that. That's a matter of belief. We can't prove or disprove it. Or at least we haven't been able to yet, one way or the other. But like science, it's like it's an evolving body of work based on testing and hypotheses and peer-reviewed work and trying out different things and evolving what we have concluded. So you can't believe or not believe in it. You can either accept it or deny it.
Yeah, you can bury your head in the sand while weather events of increasing frequency and severity continue to inundate cities around the world that are dealing with floods. As the glaciers all melt and the seas rise, as droughts beset places that before were arid. There are so many impacts of climate chaos. Here in California, it's already killing people. There were wildfires last year across much of our state that killed dozens of people. And those didn't just happen in isolation. You can't draw a direct correlation to climate chaos, right? Because it doesn't work like that. But the climate emergency has certainly increased the conditions for catastrophic events, weather related and otherwise, in which people are already dying around the world, including here within the United States, including here in California. And even though the wildfires didn't reach our district here in San Francisco, everybody in our district for weeks last year was coughing because our air quality was some of the worst in the world. We had worse air quality than Beijing at one point, and it was because of fire from wildfires made possible and essentially encouraged by drought, which was inescapably climate chaos related. And so, people who don't believe climate change probably don't watch the news or at least don't understand it. And I think that there's a real need for us to get over that hump to now fight over where the line in the sand really is between people like Speaker Pelosi, who say they believe in climate change, they acknowledge the science, they understand the science, but somehow they won't show up to do anything about it. And those of us who recognize the science, are committed to future generations. I take a great deal of inspiration from indigenous wisdom to think about the interests of 7 generations hence. And that's why I'm in this race, because those people aren't here yet to defend their interests. And frankly, the predation of corporate fossil fuel extraction and the corporate corruption of our current Congress is driving mounting crises for those people in the future. I thankfully don't have kids, but I do have 9 nephews and nieces. I have plenty of friends with children, and I care about all of them enough, frankly, that I'm willing to dedicate my life to trying to make sure that we get some of these industries and fight back and make sure that we're making decisions based on our human interests and the interests of the future, not just capital interests and putting money in someone's pocket.
I like how you framed it. Thankfully, I don't have kids. Thankfully, do that door to door. Be like, you breeders, big mistake. I didn't shit the bed on that one.
I do feel like I dodged a bullet there. I mean,
no, I know what you meant, but it just came out funny. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. You can tweet me an article at Ron Placone. We'll go through it together and make it our own. Get your news on with Ron.